Whew, that was closely. I almost didn't push the go live button, and we would have been in a lot of trouble if I realized 15 minutes in, like, oh, wait, we haven't gone live.
It would have been a nice conversation regardless. I mean,
I agree. Welcome, everybody. This is yet another episode. I don't know what number of our Bloggers Anonymous series called On Writing. And I'm joined here today by, with, and of Lee Skallerup Bessette,
weird way to put it.
who has been a longtime blogger and who currently is an ed tech at Georgetown University. And we, just before we were getting on this call, going live, we were talking about cleaning your data. Have you cleaned your data today?
Not today.
No?
Yeah, not today. There's no data to clean today. No, I'm putting out fires.
Clean your data.
I know. I'm putting out fires right now, and I'm learning that I need to clean my data a little bit better. But like,
before we get into the thick of it, and we will get into the thick of it, Lee, there's no question. I want to ask you something.
Yes.
Are you coming from your basement right now?
I am indeed coming from my basement right now. You can see my sewing space behind me. I managed to convince my daughter not to take Apollo. This is also Apollo's crate and X-Pen area. Yeah, my working space has been taken over by a giant yellow lab. Puppy.
Oh, wonderful. Good for you.
Yeah.
You have a puppy. Yes.
No. Well, we did have a puppy. Now we have a giant dog.
I thought it was a giant puppy.
Well, I don't know. He's a year now. So is that still puppy?
No.
They're like, that's like a teenager or something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
He's like 38 now.
Yeah, exactly. He's going through a midlife crisis already. It's all very.
He doesn't know what he wants to do.
Yeah,
should I get married? Is it time to have a family? I just don't know.
Do I need to get a job? Like, I don't like. Am I happy with the job I've got? He is a service dog after all. I hope he's happy with the job he has because that's what he's for. But yeah,
you and I have something in common. No, we have two things in common.
I think we have a lot more than that, but I think that it's just for the sake of this conversation.
Exactly. Humor me, Lee. Not only are we longtime bloggers, give it up for the bloggers.
Yup.
But we're both coming from our basements right now.
All right, there you go.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure. I figured it was your work area. I just didn't know it was in your basement.
It's in my basement. It's the only cool place in this house right now.
Yeah, pretty much the same.
Hot.
Yeah, same here.
Hot. Yeah. Okay. So we've established all that.
Yeah.
So let's get into your writing career and talk about Lee Skallerup Bessette as writer.
Yes.
Because that's something I'm very interested in. And I had said it before we went live today. Like, we've been going back to the well regularly from you, Lee. You did a community chat for us for Bloggers Anonymous. You wrote an amazing post on blog.reclaimhosting.com about your history as a blogger. And you also agreed to come here today and to talk a little bit about your writing more generally. So Lee as writer. And so I wanted to start from the very beginning, and you did a nice timeline. So feel free to do whatever you want with that. But like, have you always been a writer? Did you start writing from the beginning? Did you just pick up writing last week? Like, what's your relationship to writing?
Yes, last week. I decided last week that maybe writing was something I should do. It hasn't been in my social media brand from the beginning on that one.
Nope.
I've always written. Like, it's, when they say that the since debunked, but the theory of like the 10,000 hours, like you got to have 10,000 hours to really master something. I'm sure I had 10,000 hours by the time I finished high school. Like, I was just always writing. I was always journaling. I was always writing notes to my friends. Remember those when you'd fold them up into little fancy squares and pass those around and everything? I mean, I never paid attention in class because I was always writing. I was writing poetry. I was writing notes to my friends. I was writing journal entries. I was writing abandoned novels and short stories. Like, I still have it. I kept it. My mom kept it. And then she dumped it off on me. But like, I have boxes and boxes of notebooks and notes and loose papers just from high school of me writing. And I actually, my undergraduate degree is in professional writing in English. And I had originally, my goal was to be a journalist, was to be a writer. Like that was ultimately my goal. And I discovered literature, and thought, well, I'd really much rather be learning about and writing about literature. And also, so we were told, this is always the irony of my career, because like I was coming in just as the internet was coming up. I graduated from my bachelor's degree in 1999, and you would go for like the career fairs and the career advice, and you'd have journalists coming in, and basically the rule, the what everybody was saying was journalism is dying. Right, the internet is
It's
changing
been
everything, and
dying
they weren't
forever.
wrong. They weren't wrong, right? The internet is going to change everything. Journalism is dying, and I thought, great. I don't really want this kind of, come from a little bit more of a working class background, and I was like, well, I want something a little bit more stable than that. I know what I'll do. I'll become a university professor. So like, yeah, I know.
We have a lot more in common than I thought.
Yeah. so yeah. So I mean, I just and I always say, and my friend actually reminded me of that again, that like a friend of mine was hosting a server at home, right? Because you could still sort of do that in the 90s. And it started as a Yahoo news group and newsletter, and then he turned it into a website called This Is Not an Exit. And I became a contributing writer to it.
Wow. In
Right. So
99.
in 99, yeah. 90, well, I think the site started in 99, but the listserv was like 1998. So
So
um
you bring up a good point, an interesting point. I'm sorry to interrupt you there, but I have
yeah,
two
no.
things I've been really interested in talking to you about. The first is, you mentioned you're always writing. You also mentioned that you turned your writing, you pointed it at literature. And one of the things when I'm looking through your CV and your work that you've been doing, you write in more than one language. You can also write in French, and
I
you've
can.
written extensively about French literature and poetry. And so I think, I don't know this actually, I can't claim this at all, but I believe you're one of the first people who I've talked to on this series who can write, I would say fluently in two languages. And that might not be true. Someone might come on my comments and say, Jim, you're wrong. You should have done your research. Someone else could. You're the first one I know who can write in two languages. And let me ask you, as a monolinguistic idiot, which I have been and remain even as I live in Italy for 10 years, what's the process of writing in a language that's not your own, or that's not native? I don't know, however you want to say that
So
correctly, but you didn't
yeah,
grow up with, or maybe you did. I don't
I
know.
did. I mean, I did. So I grew up in, oh gosh, you've opened a can of worms now here, Jim. Like that's just the
That was
only
my
other thing I
plan
love.
all along, Lee.
Okay.
It's hard to pull you out of your shell. I'm
Oh,
doing
I
everything I
know.
can.
So I'm actually planning, like, I've actually written 200,000 words on this. It's unpublished. I don't even know what I'm going to do with it, but I wrote 200,000 words on it because I had to. So I grew up on in the western suburbs on the island of Montreal, which are historically Anglophone or English speaking suburbs. So Montreal is in Quebec. Quebec is the French speaking province in Canada. French is the official language in Quebec. It's not even considered a bilingual province. It's considered monolingual French, even though English people exist there. And I grew up going to French immersion school. So I learned, my first 3 years of schooling was entirely in French. So kindergarten grades 1 and 2 were entirely in French. In kindergarten, you could speak English still to your teacher, but she would only respond to you in French, and you would be, you were building your vocabulary and all that kind of stuff. By the time you got to first grade, you were no longer allowed to speak. As soon as you entered the school, you were supposed to only speak in French. And then and then from there on, it was half and half. So like half the day was in French and half the day was in English. And so you did your subjects in that. I did math in French for almost the entire time. Where any of the social sciences were almost always in French. And you would also do like regular French. You'd read French books, you'd write French, all of that kind of stuff. And so, I did that all through elementary and high school. I graduated with a French immersion certification. And then, but it wasn't really until I chose to go to a French language university to study English, because of course you do. And so it was really there that I was truly immersed at that point. So I had the base, right? I had the structure, I had the grammar drilled into me from a very young age and all of that. But it wasn't until I got to Sherbrooke where there was really a fluency that I developed in there. Just because, again, I spoke English at home. I spoke English to most of my friends outside of school and even inside of school. I spoke English like most of the kids on the swim team, because that was the other activity I did. They almost all were English. We had a couple French kids, but like it was, again, they understood English, I understood French, so they would speak to me in French and I would speak to them in English, and the whole politics behind that I'm not going to get into, but I was 15, so what do I know? But again, so most of the time, even though I could read and study and all of that and understand it perfectly well and communicate with people perfectly well in French, it wasn't until I spent 5 years in Sherbrooke where like everyone around me, like literally everyone around me is francophone. And so, but again, I grew up, French immersion. So I mean, I grew up and it was just like I took it for granted and I always heard French around me. We had a summer. This is something that everyone in Canada has. Everyone in Canada has a lake house. This is the thing we have,
particularly in Ontario, right?
In Ontario, but Quebec too, right? Like there's like, and so like we had a lake house in near the small francophone town my mom grew up in. And my grandfather married an English girl and ended up moving to Montreal. But his brother, my great uncle, he married a French girl and stayed there. And so for me, I grew up with a French great uncle, right? But granddad, my grandfather, he was English. But like, and so what, we would go up to the lake and there would be both languages all the time between the brothers, between the wives and all of that kind of stuff. Most of the people around us at that point were francophone too. So I mean, it was just something I always like grew up in and around, and then really immersed myself in it. And so for me, I actually been thinking a lot about that question, and it's not, I call it like almost at this point a 1A and 1B language for me, where English really is my first language, but like, I started learning French or hearing French from birth, and then learning French from pretty much like formally learning French from the age 5 on. So, it sort of sticks with it. So there are certain things that I have trouble still articulating in English because they happen to me in French. That makes any sense?
That does, yeah.
And so like it is so I don't even translate when I listen to French or I read French. I'm not even translating. It's just I understand what it is.
Do you feel the need to write certain things in English and certain things in French?
Not so much, because French for me what is still more about orality, because I spoke it way more than I wrote it.
Yeah.
And so French for me is really about orality and speaking it.
Yeah, you did scholarship in French.
Yes, I have done scholarship in French, and in a way it's easy. Like scholarship is probably the easiest form of French for me to write because it is so formal. And so it's very structured and very rules oriented, and that's that's pretty good. But in terms of like writing nonfiction in French, or like creative nonfiction or even fiction in French, I'm not as comfortable with that. But again, I can tell stories in French, if that makes sense.
Can I ask you this? Have you ever considered becoming a French blogger?
No.
Why not?
I don't need that kind of stress in my life.
Why would that be more stress?
Here's the other thing about the French.
I like where this is going.
Well,
Let
look,
me tell you
we have
another thing about the
we
French.
have freaking language police in Quebec. Like, this is not like we have language police in Quebec. Like, I just came back from a trip to Montreal where it was a whole bunch of digital humanists descending on Montreal and onto Université de Montréal's campus. And but we all had a great time and learned that Montreal is an old city that isn't tremendously accessible. But also, like, I had to explain to them, they're like, everybody, even though we're speaking English, everybody always comes up to us and starts speaking to us in French. I'm like, yes, because that's the law. And they're like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, in Quebec, we have language laws. And one of the language laws is that you are not allowed to address anyone, even if they are clearly speaking English. If they have not addressed you directly in English, you have to start the conversation in French.
So are there French blog language laws?
Well, I'm sure there's not, but at the same time, I don't need the grammar. I already have I already have the blogger dudes, shitting on my English, right?
Yeah,
I don't need
exactly.
French blogger dudes shitting on my French too, which,
Hey, I hear you.
and also there is something. This is also a bit of like just positionality and identity. Like there is something, and this is again from my 5 years in Sherbrooke, is that I am from Quebec. I'm from Montreal. I'm fluently bilingual, but I'm not francophone, right?
Meaning
And
what? So when you say that you're not francophone, what does that mean? You sound pretty
it's
francophone to me.
so I mean it's because I grew up speaking English in the home, and I mean that is the definition of an anglophone. An anglophone is somebody who grew up speaking English at home. Francophone is you spoke French at home. Allophone is you spoke neither French nor English at home.
That's an allophone.
Allophone, that's what they call them in Quebec. They're
Oh,
allophones. Um, again, there's these weirdness, and this is why I write 200,000 words about it. Is that there's this weirdness that until you start explaining to Quebec to people outside of Quebec, you're like,
yeah.
yeah, this is just how I grew up. Of course,
I've I've heard some of it, obviously,
yeah,
because we've talked about it before.
yeah,
So I have some of that, but also, you know, I know Canadians and they talk about, well, Montreal is like its own thing, Quebec City, its own thing, right? In
yeah.
terms of that. But let me ask you this: that 200,000 words you've written about this very thing, is it fiction? Is it nonfiction? Is it journaling? Like,
It's
that's a
it's
lot of words. Like,
it's.
what have you
I
what have
have
you
all the
written and what does it
words.
look like?
As
You have
my
a lot
husband
of
as my
words.
husband jokes about me, he's like, you just have all the words. It's fine. Um, so it's really like what I was trying to do is I was trying to, because I'm the person who annoyingly explains Quebec to people, like I am right now, right?
Yes.
Like that's why I say you open a can of worms. Like somebody will ask something at a party about Quebec, and I'll just like, oh shit, you're in for it now.
Exactly.
Um,
Hold my beer.
yeah, hold no, give me another three more and sit down and make
Yeah.
yourselves comfortable. Um, but so that there's all of this. I was trying to capture a moment in time to have grown up English or grown up Anglophone in Montreal and then going to a French school in Sherbrooke in Quebec during one of, not the most, but one of the most tumultuous times in the history of both Canada and more specifically Quebec. So I am what is known as a Bill 101 baby. And Bill 101 was really the first major language law in Quebec. And Bill 101, one of the biggest things there was sign laws and there was language laws, but one of the biggest things that happened is that um, you could only go to English school if one of your parents had gone to English school. So within Canada. And
Got it.
so I was able to go to English school because my mom had gone to English school. Um, and so if you were a francophone and both your parents went to French school and they wanted to send you to an English school, they couldn't. They had to send you to a French school. And if you were a new immigrant to Quebec, you could not choose what school system you went into, you had to go to a French school. So, and so think about the impact that that has on who goes to what schools. And then on top of that, going all the way back to the British North American Act, it was illegal not to have religious-based school boards and school systems in Quebec. So not only are you impacted by this new language law, but you're also impacted by this law guaranteeing or requiring religious schooling in the province of Quebec. So you could have 5 kids living all next to each other at the same time. And one could be going to an English Catholic school, the other one could be going to an English Protestant school, and then one could be going to a French Catholic school, and the other one could be going to a French Protestant school. But then there were also the like weird non-denominational schools that you could also go to. So like you could have a neighborhood
like Europe.
Yeah. I mean, there's also very European things around there. So again, like when you grow up in it, you're just like, yeah, I went to a Catholic school, and everyone's like, ooh, fancy. And I'm like, no, it's just like, I went to a Catholic school. When you're in it, you don't realize it. And then, so we went, I was too young for the 1980 referendum, but all of those Bill 101 babies, we all turned 18 just in time to vote in the 1995 referendum. And that was there's a long period of, particularly in the 90s, of language laws. There's the Angry Anglo. There was increased sign laws. There was all of this sort of thing going on that leads up to this 1995 referendum around whether or not Quebec should separate. And it came down to not very many votes. It was like 51 point something to 49 point something for Quebec to stay in Canada.
So it was a pretty much like we want out of Canada.
Yeah, but also we did that, but it didn't happen. And so if you want an event to like shape someone's life in terms of the importance of voting,
yeah,
barely getting something through or not through one way or the other is an awfully good way to do it. And then immediately afterwards, in 1996, after this really contentious, politicized referendum, I was like, no, I'm going to go to a French university. Yeah. And so, pretty much we guaranteed that all of my classmates voted yes in the referendum. And I, the Anglophone, clearly voted no.
So can I ask you, is that writing pretty much like a memoir? Is it a history?
It's both. Like, and that's the weird thing where you have to like, there are these moments, these moments in my sort of history, or the history of Montreal, or the history of Quebec and Canada, that you sort of have to, again, trace back and say, like, why were there religious schools? Well, that's the British North American Act, and part of the deal for, part of the deal for Quebec coming, or lower, the merging of Upper and Lower Canada, and making sure that we could keep the peace between the two. And, and then there's the whole history of the Catholic Church in Quebec that comes into play as well. And then there's, just like why Montreal was in the state it was in the 90s, having to do all the way back to the October crisis. And so there are these small histories of like this small area where you're like, I grow up in this really this really weird, strange place where I'm like, I'm a linguistic minority in a province, but I'm the linguistic majority within the North American context.
Sure.
But
it's compelling. And it's compelling also because you nailed it. Like, a memoir in many ways is a small history about someone's life in the context of the broader historical movements. And this sounds like a great frame for that. Now, I really love to hear you talk about that. So there's one part of your writing, 200,000 word memoir. You need to edit it. I'll put you in touch with someone. It can't be 200,000 words if we're going to make money off it. But like,
I'm never making money off anything, man. Like, I gave up on that train a long time ago. I became an academic. Come on. Like,
now we're going to cut to the 90s, which is an
Yeah.
interesting moment because it's parallel to what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And you mentioned something I think people who maybe watch this and are of a certain generation, as my wife likes to say, of a certain age, that's meaning we will not disclose that
Yeah.
age, that, when you were coming up and graduating college or moving into a career in 99, 95, 2000, even, like, it was like AI hype, but now for .com. Like,
Yeah.
you can basically say, yeah, I know what an A tag is. You're hired.
Yeah.
I know how to write basic HTML.
Yeah.
Come
I did
on
know.
in.
Yeah. No, I did. I mean, one of my I had, and I've told this story before, but it's still a good one, where I walked into a desktop publishing class, because again, I was a professional writing in English, because it had internships and you would get jobs, and it trained you for a whole variety of different careers in writing, technical writing, editing, translating, as well as journalism. And this was the telecom boom. We didn't even call it the .com boom. In the 90s, it was the telecom boom. Particularly in Montreal. Like, Nortel was a big freaking deal in Canada. Corel, if anybody, all our WordPress lovers, Corel,
Corral, absolutely.
in Ottawa and Southern Ontario, like, and people forget as well, Blackberry, a great movie, by the way, adaptation
I
about,
loved it,
yeah,
actually. I
it
saw it. I
was
loved it.
so good. But again, like, people forget that that sort of band from Montreal down into the Great Lakes, that sort of band of universities and technologies, all throughout those universities, Waterloo, from McGill all the way down to Waterloo, sort of thing. Like, there's a lot of really excellent engineering schools all up and down there. I remember I had a lot of friends who went into engineering at McGill, and like, Boston was another big tech hub, and Boston would come up and just hire all of these engineers from McGill, basically so that they wouldn't work for the competition in Montreal. Like, it's
this is kind of on topic, but not really. The person who did all of the graphics for Jurassic Park and Mask and
yeah,
Terminator 2, he went to a Canadian college.
yeah,
He was a Canadian. I'm forgetting his name,
yeah,
but he was part of what you're saying, that kind of tech
yeah,
hub in Canada of that moment. And he did some of the greatest. I mean, he's the one who convinced them
yeah,
to make that dinosaur entirely digital,
yeah,
which is kind of blows open the doors for digital creation and
yeah.
film.
And
So
there were some video game companies based out of there. There was just like, it wasn't just like I said, it wasn't just a .com boom. It was really a tech boom, telecom, video
yeah.
games, all of these kinds of things. It was this big boom. And so I walk into a class called desktop publishing in 96 or 97. And it's a professional in the field, right? He basically sits us down and say, listen, he says, I don't need 15 weeks to teach you FrameMaker anymore, right? It's becoming more and more what you see is what you get. It's not that complicated. And he's like, it is evolving so quickly now that whatever I teach you in this class right now is not going to be relevant in a year and a half, because they're going to come out with a new edition. It's going to be even simpler and more straightforward. He said, if you want to differentiate yourselves moving forward, he's like, you need to learn HTML. So we spend 7 weeks, 6 weeks on learning the basics of FrameMaker, which I have no memory of whatsoever. But then he spent the last parts teaching us how to hand code in HTML, teaching us about the 1x1 clear GIF that you would use in order to make spacing on your web page work, because it was still CSS was kind of still experimental. And then, I and also, if you found a website where you really liked the code of it, you just stole it. You just like looked at the source and copied and pasted it and then changed stuff in it. And that was fine. And so, like, I learned how to hand code in HTML, and we all just sort of shrugged our shoulders, right? Like, we were all just like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
And figured it out. I mean, we also were the first. Sherbrooke was a big engineering school as well. It was another tech engineering school, and they, they had just wired when I showed up all of the residence halls for high speed internet access. So it wasn't dial up. It's not high speed. It was like fiber optic. I don't remember.
Yeah, it's like T1 or something.
Yeah, something. I don't even. We got a networked phone and we got an email address. Prior to us, you had to request an email address. You had to pay for your own internet access in your room on dial-up. But we got it all, and it was all included, right? And, starting off, we had to get our email by Pine.
Pegasus is what I use, but
yeah,
absolutely.
And I didn't understand what I was doing was command line stuff. It was just like, open this, type in these things, and you'll get your email. I was like, okay. It was like, you're going to FTP now. So do this and do that. And that's how you're going to upload your text files as HTML as websites. You're just like, okay, 19 years old. I don't know. Like, you give me directions, I'll follow them. And like, oh, look at me, I made a web page. And so it was that kind of time, and it really was like, I got one of my work terms because I knew how to code in HTML. And even then it was already kind of seen as obsolete because Front Page came out, the very first Front Page 1.0 from Microsoft, for a more what you see is what you get interface for creating web pages. So but I had to debug the code.
So the guy who I'm talking about was named Steve Williams.
Yeah.
And he went to Sheridan College. Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, aware about that. And that was the one.
Yeah.
But the point that you're making is a good one. So I just want to clear the record. But the point you're making, so I'm 1994. I'm on UCLA's campus. I'm taking, of all things, a Dostoevsky class because, like you, I studied literature. And this professor we had was crazy. And he's like, look, everyone, come down with me to this lab in the bottom of Haynes Hall. I still remember where it was. And we're going to do, for our final project, you're going to create an HTML text. So you're going to copy like the Underground Man, and you're going to link parts of it to readings that people have done in the class. So you're going to do a little analysis and hot link it.
Yeah.
And they called it hot links at the time.
Yes,
or whatever.
yes. It was hot linking.
What is this?
Yeah.
And that was from that class that I basically, and to your point, UCLA was just, we basically just got real high-speed network, and we would kind of link our computers where I worked, which was audiovisual services, and play Doom like back to back. And so like there was a moment historically, kind of like your memoir, that kind of prepares you for the career you were going to have and for the person you were going to be as a writer. So as a writer, once you hit this digital space, how did your mentality change? Like, how did your sense of writing and who you were change in relationship to that? Or did it?
I think so. I think one of the things like all right, I was undiagnosed with ADHD. And so this idea of branching out and linking out to various places just made sense to me because that's how my brain works, right? These asides, even just conversation right now, right? Like, let me link out. My brain will do that automatically. Let me link out and talk about this other thing, but then bring it back to it's relevant. I swear to God. Side quests. Now we're just calling them side quests, but like, I'm always on a side quest. It's a constant side quest, but that was what dynamic linking was about. And so my writing, and I talk about this in the piece that I wrote, writing online was always just this really great way where it's like different places got different parts of me, which was fine. And they were all interconnected, right? And you could link to any one of them. And so I was constantly linking back on what I was writing and what I was doing, in terms of being able to connect everything. Like, it really was like it. There's this really great comic from Danny with ADHD, right? Where how a how a neurotypical person tells a story and it's linear, and then how someone with ADHD tells a story and it's all of these interconnected boxes. And I mean, and that's the web, right? The web is already how an ADHD brain, some ADHD brains, is how, or a non-neurotypical, a neurodivergent brain works. So that's the same thing with Twitter. Twitter always made sense to me, right? And it's real funny how everyone that I really got along well with Twitter, and everyone who really loved Twitter, we all found out that we're neurodivergent. Like, it's ridiculous the number of us where like, oh, we all are autistic or have ADHD. Huh, shocking how that happened. But like again, people are like, how do you like, Twitter made sense to me, right? All of this interconnected stuff, all of this mashup, all of this information. It wasn't an overload for me because it was like, this is how my brain works. My brain wants all of these things. My brain wants sewing alongside hockey, alongside literature, alongside news from Montreal, alongside what's going on in technology, alongside all of this, because that's all part of me. That's all part of my thought process. That's all part of my brain already. And so, if anything, the way it changed the way I wrote is it really liberated me to be able to write the way that made the most sense to me. There's one of the frustrating pieces of writing advice that I got was from an editor who was desperately trying, again, this was kind of a very memoirish piece. And we were going back and forth on it, back and forth. And she's like, finally, she just said, stop moving in and out of time. And I was like, huh, yeah, that is what I do. And there is something about the web which allows you to move in and out of time in a way. Yeah. That is, it's yeah. And so like, yeah, so it really was this liberating part of me to be able to again, write in a way that just made a lot of sense, but could also then be accessible to other people.
I like the way you describe Twitter as or writing, and what you're talking about with the web. Twitter as an example of this, coming in and out of time and walking into conversations and walking out of them seamlessly. And then also watching what would be a diverse network of folks kind of collapse into each other.
Yes.
And, merely make that kind of distance, invisible. I mean, I think it's still a network we miss in some ways.
Yeah.
Because of that. And it really worked beautifully. And unfortunately, the political and geopolitical forces that be kind of made that impossible. But I often think about this, like when I thought about Twitter and I was doing Twitter, as early as 2007 or whenever, one of the things that everyone talked about is, I don't want to know what you had for lunch. It was the big kind of like, mantra.
I desperately want to know.
Yeah, exactly. You, on the other hand. But one of the things I started to see is, and to your point, these people who came on and actually understood Twitter as a form, as a way of writing, as a way of communicating, as a new way of building a story in 140 characters or telling. And that to me was really compelling. I may not have been as good as a lot of these people at doing it, but I was truly fascinated with the idea of like, here we have, watching in front of me, a completely new format and style or genre, whatever we want to call it, of writing and of connecting. And it was both social as well as it was informational, as well it was kind of like, I don't know, open and accessible. There was that sense of the public writing that was truly compelling. So to your point, I do think, and the neurodivergent stuff is interesting because I often think like, are they reflective of a new cultural moment? Right? I don't understand. I'm not a historian, nor am I a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a doctor, nor am I pretending to be. But I often wonder if, how do these new forms that get created maybe reflect the state of the mind of the people who are engaging in them?
Yeah. And, I think that the more we learn about these things and the more you kind of see who, oh, what's the word I'm looking for? I've lost all my words. Drawn, those who are drawn to Twitter as a medium, as a mode, as a way of communicating, as a way of connecting, as a way of forming community. It appealed to, again, that sort of way that we were. So a lot of the times, this is a big thing, and Amy and I, my co-host for All the Things ADHD podcast, one of the things that we were constantly being told is that we were too much, right? And there was no way to be too much on Twitter, which was just liberating, right? There was no way to be too much on Twitter. Or if I was being too much, you'd just mute me or turn it off or whatever it is. But eventually, like, there was just this ability within the format of it. And again, I put Twitter as a central part of my writing. It was all just flowing in and out of each other. Of my blogging, of my memoir writing, of the stuff I did on pen on paper, all of that. It's all interconnected for me. You might not be able to see the big picture, which is fine. It's huge, and I don't even know if I could handle it. But like, I know and I understand, and there are people who would get parts of me, and that's fine, because that too muchness was sort of tampered down with all of the other noise that was going on Twitter. That makes sense, right? If you're only following me, then yeah, it's way too much. Follow about 500 other people and I'm perfectly manageable.
Exactly. Yeah, and to your point, you could decide what you could and couldn't read or engage.
Yep.
I mean, you had a certain amount, and you would come into that, flow, and you would leave that flow as you wanted. Like you
Yep.
said, you could mute people. I mean, I'm just fascinated with, the new forms of writing the web introduced, right? And the new forms of communicating. And like you said, you weren't, you did many of them. You
Yeah.
did blogging, you did Twitter, right? You write scholarly works, you do memoirs. Like, you're kind of, a polyglot, if you will, when it comes to different formats. And
Yeah.
I'm interested in that. What format do you feel most comfortable in?
I really do think memoir. I mean, if anything, Twitter is just a live memoir. It's a live journal.
Yeah.
Like RIP live journal. But I think I mean, one of the authors that I ended up getting drawn to in literature wrote those kinds of books and wrote those kinds of stories. And maybe it was also the kind of sociological approach that the Quebecois really took to literature. Like, literature was never done in a vacuum. Literature is always a product, particularly in Quebecois literature, it is always a product of the socio-political conditions. And so even pure fiction, you can always, read those sociological influences within it, and you would always be reading those kinds of things. And so, like, that was sort of because that was kind of my introduction to literary theory, was that form of literary theory. I think that's very much how that's really informed my writing too, where it's just like, straight memoir is fine, but like, what makes it interesting, I think, are these very particular sociopolitical situations in which influence that particular moment in which you happen to be 8 years old.
Yeah.
Right. And that only comes in hindsight, because when you're 8, you're just like, whatever. Um, I have French neighbors, but I don't speak French at home. Whatever. Isn't that everybody's childhood? No. Oh, you realize it after the fact. And it isn't until, it isn't until I go to Sherbrooke and interact with almost exclusively Francophones that I kind of get a perspective on the upbringing that I had. And then it's moving to Alberta, which is like the Texas of Canada, and how they view Quebec and how Quebec has hijacked Canadian politics for our entire lives. That you kind of understand again how bizarre in neither a good or a bad way. It's just unique.
Yeah.
That situation is. And then I moved to the States, right? And so there are all of these kinds of contexts that inform the looking back, right? And to be able to look back and say, it's yeah, this is the story, but this is what makes the story interesting,
Yeah. It's
right?
it's it's funny you should say this. I was writing. I'm doing like you. I do more than I probably can do, and I'm doing a podcast with someone by the name of Michael Branson Smith, great guy, and we're doing a podcast on family film. It's called I always forget what it's called. Family. It's
Wait,
the
wait,
Family Pictures podcast. There it is. He laughs at me because I can never remember it. So anyway, but one of the things I got from this was, to your point about reflection. I was writing a post about this great movie we watched called Vengeance is Mine. And as I was doing it, and I think this is part of the podcast, is I was reflecting on, as an 8 or 12-year-old, a kind of thing that had happened. And
Yeah.
I wrote it in my blog post as part of the film. But then I was like, you know what? That would be an interesting short story, or that would be an interesting kind of bigger picture because it deals with certain things, not necessarily relevant here, but enough for me to think of I've defined myself as a blogger. So
Mhm.
enough for me to think about what would it mean, because I'm not a very good writer, what would it mean to foray into a different format
Yeah.
or to a different medium? I mean, I'm writing long enough. Why not try something else? Why am I sticking to the blog? Especially when, in the moment where Twitter has gone and there's a lot of fracturing, why not put energy towards something else?
Well, I mean, don't sell yourself short on you're not a bad writer. You're a really good writer. Like, just stop that. You've written so
I
much that
didn't pay Lee to say that, but I'm glad Lee said that.
but no, I mean, and this is
Say it
my
again, Lee.
no, this is my. I taught freshman writing for a long time, and I taught freshman writing at schools to students who'd been utterly broken and defeated by the K-12 system, and so all came into class thinking that they could not write. And just like it's so it you find, but I mean, for me, I'm terrible at writing fiction. I've tried. It's awful. It's inauthentic. It is, it's not very good. And to me, experimenting is fun, right? Like, it's fun, and I can, I'm better at poetry than I am at fiction, but I'm not really that great at poetry either. But I kind of enjoy the form and the function and the kind of challenge that is. But I mean, if you found a mode that works for you and your voice and your purpose, like, you shouldn't feel bad about it. Again, it's sort of carrying over. It sounds to me, now we're going to get into total like armchair therapist here, but you've
Thank you.
internalized the idea that some forms of writing are better than other forms of writing. And I mean, writing on the web, and this was why I gave up writing on the web you can't find me on the web between the years of 2001 and 2005, because I started a PhD program in comparative literature where they said writing on the internet is a waste of time. And I was blogging on Inside Higher Ed, where everyone in the comments really enjoyed telling me how much I was wasting my time
The
blogging.
lowest of low, a
Yes,
blogger.
exactly. A blogger. Ew. Right?
Ew,
But it's
even the term.
yeah, and I mean, but I mean, it's all still writing, and it's all still valuable, right?
Yeah.
It's just we have a kind of fetish around print culture, which fine, it was the dominant culture, and for a while it was sacred, right? You couldn't access the print, right? There was no way. Books were expensive, they were hard to make. Most people couldn't read. There is something understandably that we hold sacred about the printed word, particularly printed as a book, right?
Yeah.
That the effort required to go into it made it even more valuable. And so there was like this moment, and I think much like the printing press, right? Everybody thought that like if everyone's going to have a book, then like everybody's going to learn things and they're going to think things, and that's a dangerous thing. And we went through the same panic when we went online, but we're still trying to get over that. And it's interesting to me. And again, this is this sort of thing where it was like academic blogging was like poo-pooed on, right? But for whatever reason, we've been okay with academic podcasting. Even though very often what we do or say in an academic podcast is almost immaterially no different than what we would have written on a blog.
That's a good point. That's interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, except maybe it's a conversation like what we're having right here, which is, kind of, this is a longer sustained conversation than say comments on a blog, right? Even though they could be and that kind of stuff. But like it's just really interesting to me that we still like we've like blogging. Now it's everyone has a podcast. That's great. I love that too. I love listening to my podcast. I've got a podcast. You've got a podcast. We all have a podcast.
We all have a podcast now.
No, but we do, right? Think about like now it's like you're proud to say I have a podcast. Everyone's like, oh, that's so cool. Where it's like, again, back when it was like, I have a blog, everybody's like, whatever, dude.
Or even a podcast for a little while, like it blew up and then it went away, and everybody's like,
and then
podcast, and then it came back.
Yeah, and then it came
vengeance.
Back. Yeah. And now like that is people of a certain age. I'm not on TikTok. I'm like, that's another, get my right. But I mean, for I think us Gen Xers, now the podcast is sort of taken over as our kind of mean and mode, which again is just fascinating. Where like I don't have a script when I the ADHD podcast. We don't have a script. Do not have a script. We don't even have a topic when we start our, like Amy and I get online and we're like, what do you want to talk about today? I'm like, I don't know. Like, I read something in New York Times. Maybe
Squirrel.
I'm like, sure. No, I mean literally I'll get a tweet halfway through the podcast and I'm like, oh, Amy, this tweet just came up.
Exactly.
Which again is fine if you like that kind of podcast. But it's again like this idea of one genre of communicating, of connecting, of narrating is more valuable than another one. And I think blogging still is getting the short shrift on that, where like, God, have you ever counted how many words that you've written on your blog?
No.
Yeah, millions.
I can't imagine.
Millions.
I wrote 5,000 words this week.
Well, yeah, exactly. And so, like, at a certain point, right, like, that makes you a good writer. It does. I mean, that you are able to produce. Look, do not, like, I have now staked my career on the fact that I can write a lot of words pretty well, pretty quickly. That is that is a skill that I myself took for granted, that I just figured everybody had because I hung out with other bloggers and writers. But like, people will look at you and be like, where the hell did that come from? And I mean, I know I can consistently write about 1,000 to 1,500 words in about an hour if it's a topic that I am familiar with, that I know about, and that I have thoughts on. Right? Like it's pretty much like,
after this podcast, after this episode, I'm not surprised. I'm just going to say that.
Yeah. Well, but I have all the words again, all the words. But that in itself is a skill, right? Yeah. It is a skill that is, not common. Right. And so you think it like, if you think about, put it on like a musical instrument thing, right? Where it's like, I'm not good at playing the piano. I can sort of play, right? Yeah. And most people aren't great pianists, right? But they can, put out a tune that people will be like, well, I can't do that, right? And I kind of see my writing, and I'm inviting others who see their writing is like, you don't have to be great at it.
Yeah.
Right? But you just keep practicing it because it makes sense and it brings you joy and it helps you make sense of your life and it connects you to other people, right? Like I'm not, I'm never going to get a Nobel Prize. I am never going to get, any of these kinds of things. But like, and I said, we're coming to the end and this is a good place to conclude. But I say it in my blog post is that, we write for ourselves because it helps us make sense of the world, right? Helps us make sense of the world. It helps get stuff out of our brains and someplace else. But it really does help us connect with other people.
Yeah.
And that you do not know the impact or importance or significance of what you have written until somebody else reads it, right? And so we can write for ourselves, we can write to make ourselves happy. And you're a good writer if just one person has read the work that you have done and it has resonated with them and it has had an impact on them, right? That's what makes you a good writer, right?
No, I mean, I always joke on that, and I'm probably gonna keep on making it a bigger joke with my
Yeah.
writing. But I do want to say I have a question, because this is something really based on what you're talking about, particularly with the memoir and your writing, and obviously you're blogging, Twitter. You're multifaceted,
It's all
right?
memoir. It's all memoir.
Yeah,
It's all memoir.
exactly. But do you believe that everyone has at least one great story in them to share?
Yeah, I think so. I think
I think so
everybody,
too, actually.
I mean, if anything, but I'm also fascinated by other human beings,
Yeah.
right? Like that is part of what I loved about Twitter is just to get to learn so much about other people and to be taken out of my own context and out of my own bullshit and just be like, there are lives that I could never even imagine just existing, and Moorhead taught me that, teaching at Moorhead State taught me that, going to Sherbrooke taught me that, going to like all of these places where I have met people whose backgrounds were so unlike my own. And just adding that where it's like I love people's stories. Part of my hyper focus is other people.
Yeah.
Right, is that I can I want to focus in, and there's a weird intensity to it and I get that. And I can stop talking about myself long enough to hear other people's stories. I can. It happens. Um but like but I'm fascinated by other people. I'm fascinated by it, and but I you know most of the time the people who don't think they have a good story to tell are the people who do. The people are like, let me tell you my story. I'm like, I could care less.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It's like Dan Aykroyd in Twilight Zone. Can I tell
I
you a
never saw that one.
story? Oh, it's really good. Let me
Okay.
tell you a
I'll look it up.
story.
I'll
It's
go look
really
it
good.
up.
And then he tells him a very tricky story.
Yeah.
But okay, we are coming down to the end. You are right. Last word, advice for those folks who want to pick up the pen, whether digital or otherwise, and write. Why?
Because you can. I mean, I think that no, but like we kind of alluded
Oh,
to that before, is that for a long time we did not have access. Most people did not have access to the written word. And the fact that we are literate, we are allowed to write, and that we have the means to be able to do it, we take massively for granted. And I think that it is important that we keep exercising that, whether or not it's good or bad, but that we keep exercising that right and that ability. Because again, this is not something that in the history of humanity we have long had access to. And there are still people in the world who do not have access to this, who are kept in illiteracy, who do not have the means or even the permission to write or to speak in that sort of sense. So I think it's really important that we keep that in mind, because once we contextualize it that way, then even just is like fuck the haters, right?
yeah.
Like, that voice in your head, that tells you what you have to say isn't worth saying, isn't worth writing, that's internalized elitism, that's internalized all kinds of bullshit, right? And so let that bullshit go, right? Like, just, and I'm not saying that that's easy, but like at the end of the day, why are people so invested on you not writing?
Yeah.
Right? Why are so many people invested? Why is there that voice? Why is there that societal pressure that tells you what you have to say isn't worth it? Right? What is that? What is that that's trying to keep you quiet, to not put pen to paper? Right? And once you start thinking of that, then you're like, fuck it. These, the madder people got on me in the comments, the more I wanted to write.
Exactly. I agree. Hey, look, Lee Skallerup Bessette for life.
Ready
Thank you for
writing,
joining
man.
us.
Ready writing.
Ready writing
Changed my life.
for
Changed my
life.
life.
You're the best, Lee. Thank you for
Thanks,
joining
Jim.
us.
My
And
pleasure.
everybody, thank you for tuning in yet again.
Yes.
You very, very kind folks in the comments on Discord. Throw some love Lee's way. That was awesome, Lee. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jim. Take care, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.
Bye.